Hello, this is Sean Andrew Murray, and this is a quick Q&A demo of how to make sure that your characters' heads and faces look the same from different angles. So, just wanted to start off here. As you can see, I'm doing a front view of a character. Um, Starting with the front view because I want to show or experiment with how I can give myself some clues in this view as to how he's going to look in the side view. One of the most, I think, challenging things about creating characters and drawing characters over and over again, especially when you're doing comic books, something sequential where you're having to redraw the same character multiple times, is making sure that it always looks like the same character. Um, and so that's sort of the heart of this particular issue. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your character looks interesting, that he's unique, he or she is unique, that there are features that this particular character has that perhaps your other characters in the story don't have. It's okay, I think, especially with visual mediums like comic books and video games, to to play with exaggeration, to push the iconography of your characters. Uh, you have a visual medium here, and you can create interesting characters. And while subtlety might be the best thing for some characters, it might not be the best thing for all characters, right? You don't want someone to be, reading a comic book and unable to parse the difference between the various characters. You want them to, be able to recognize their favorite characters immediately in the scene. And much the same way that we recognize people that we know uh, from great distances, even if they might be very, very small on the horizon, there are certain things about people that we know very well that we pick up on, and we can read those visual cues from great distances. So, but it's a little harder in a visual medium where you're drawing a character. It's a little harder to make that evident if a character isn't moving and if it's a character you're not like intimately familiar with. So you have to play with things like the silhouette, right? So like for instance, this character, he's got this very sort of pointy chin, his ears kind of stick out, and he's got a crazy mohawk, right? Or a semi faux hawk, I guess. His head is, a little big for his neck. Um, so, and he's got this sort of big mustache as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that the first thing to do is to make sure that you're designing characters that aren't so similar and subtle that it's difficult to determine what makes them interesting and unique and what will make them recognizable from various angles. Um, that said, one of the main um, issues with drawing characters from different angles is that you have to make sure that you're getting the proportions right uh, on the different angles, and that the size of features like noses and eyes and things, and the placement of those features is the same in the various angles. Um, One of the easiest way to do this, as you'll see coming up soon, is when you're working with straight on angles like front and side, is to use guidelines. But when you're drawing a comic, not everything is going to be straight on front view or side view. So what I'm suggesting in this Q&A is that you start by doing that. Like if you have a character design, you start by drawing that character from various straight-on angles using the guidelines method. And that the more you draw that character, the more familiar you become with his or her features and proportions. And once you've done that a few times, once you've drawn that character from a few different straight-on angles, maybe even drawing it from the front view and side view more than one time, or drawing the left side and right side, top and bottom, or even the back of their head. Once you start doing that, you start to become familiar with this character, like you become familiar with a friend or a family member. And you start to sort of intuitively understand their features and their proportions. And that will help you when you're trying to draw that character from non-straight-on angles. So as you'll see here, I'm first concerned about, creating an interesting character with interesting features. So I'm thinking about in this front view that he has, as you can tell, I've tried to indicate that he's got a very sort of strong nose that is chiseled and has that sort of arch or bump, and then it goes straight down, and he's got sort of medium to wide nostrils, but it's a fairly thick nose. It's a fairly prominent feature on his face, and he's got large, wide eyes, um, sort of piercing eyes with those heavy eyebrows above, and then a thick mustache hiding his upper lip, fairly thick lower lip, and then chiseled jawbone, prominent ears, and he's got that mohawk again. So what I'm trying to do is make sure that the features are that he's not uneven, right? Or not too uneven. I think, you as you saw, I took one half. I drew one half of his face. I cut off the other half, then copied and pasted the one half, flipped it. But you don't want to just settle for doing that. People's faces aren't always perfectly symmetrical. I don't think anyone's face is perfectly symmetrical. And if it's too perfectly symmetrical, I think it looks weird. So you want to try to finesse that. You want to do the flip, flipping half of the face in order to give yourself sort of some information about placement of the eyes and the width of the nose and all that stuff, so that it's not really way off. And of course, flipping the canvas will help you to get that accurately. But you want to make sure the features are fairly symmetrical, unless this is a character who's got a completely asymmetrical face for whatever reason. But most people have fairly symmetrical faces. And then using a bit of shading, I'm trying to indicate sort of the depth of his features. How deeply set are his eye sockets? How much does his nose protrude? These are all things that will help me once I go to the side view. So I'm already I'm already telling the viewer something about this character that will be obvious in the side view. We're not left to wonder, is his nose, or at least we're not left to wonder very much about, how much does his nose stick out? How pointy is his chin? These are all things that we can show in the front view. Using shading and line width and shadows, and even just the shape of the features and the way you represent them in the front view. There are all kinds of ways to show things that are much easier to illustrate in the side view, as you'll see. But because we've tackled it here, we're starting to become familiar with this character, right? So about to start on the side view. So I'm flipping the canvas. As you know, it seems a little off. And what's good about Photoshop, obviously, is you have a lot of tools for helping you to adjust things like this, warping and distorting, warp and distortion tools are very helpful for, um, especially someone like myself. My drawings tend to be a bit lopsided, um, and I don't see it until I flip the canvas. And I usually, I in full admission here, I avoid flipping the canvas sometimes because I'm afraid of what I'm going to see when I flip the canvas. But you really have to do it because you know there are things that you may not be seeing, um, and it happens to me all the time. And I know it's scary sometimes to flip your canvas, but you just have to do it. Um, So take it from me. I avoid doing it too. So don't be embarrassed, but definitely flip your canvas to make sure that your proportions are even and that things aren't completely lopsided or slanted or tilted. Um, so now I'm starting the side view. As you can see, I'm using a separate layer with light guidelines to indicate sort of major features. Like tip of the nose, the center line of the eyes, the top and the bottom of the head, maybe even where the jawbone turns. But don't go overboard, right? You start putting in too many guidelines, you're going to find yourself quickly confused. Now comes the really sort of hard part and frustrating part. As you start to put in your features and follow the guidelines, you'll find that things don't seem to fit like you think they would. Like what looks like you know a large space for the mustache in the front view, as you're working on the side view, you suddenly discover you feel like it's squished or that it's not um, as much space as you had thought it was. But really, it's about playing here. What you may not be realizing is that in the front view, it may look like there's a lot of space, but it's sort of an optical illusion, right? And there might be what you think is a lot of space in between the tip of the nose and the bottom of the mustache. Really, what it is it's the fact that the nostrils um, go up, and the top of the mustache is underneath of the tip of his nose. So the tip of his nose comes down over that mustache, and it's something that you just have to start. You have to keep drawing and drawing because initially, as I'm drawing this side view, as you can see, I wasn't I wasn't quite getting it. Like it didn't feel like it was looking like this character. And a lot of that is about pulling and pushing the features. Um, Maybe that nose needs to come out further, or maybe the chin needs to go back further, or maybe you know um, the eyes aren't set back deep enough. Um, it's just one of those things. You have to keep playing with it and keep playing with it. And this is where you're starting to become familiar with your character. You're starting to understand the features that your character has and how they interrelate. Um, so, so while his eyes are fairly deep set, he doesn't have a straight across forehead. It does curve back, where as you can see in his eyebrows curve back towards his ears. So it's not like this really flat front forehead. Um, his chin is pointy, but it doesn't stick out further than his nose. Um, and his mustache is very full and thick, but it sort of goes underneath of his nose, right? His nose comes out over that mustache. So, these are just sort of things that you start realizing and recognizing it, and what happens is your visual memory is being built for this character. Um, now that you've drawn him in 2 views, you're starting to understand him in 3 dimensions. And that's really vitally important to getting it right. Um, so now, as you can see, I'm fairly confident that he looks like the same character in the front view as he does in the side view. You know, the other thing is some people don't look as you would expect them to look from different angles. You ever had that thing where you think you recognize somebody and you're seeing them from the side, and then they turn towards you and you realize, oh, that's not that person at all. Um, so, you know, there are some things that you can't necessarily predict from one view to the next. All right, so now the next step, the final step here, is that I want to try drawing this character from some different angles. So I want to do sort of a top-down view, but I'm not going to do exactly top-down because I wouldn't see any of his features. So I'm going to do a slightly angled top-down view so that I can play with what his features look like, um, you know, as if I was looking down on him. And again, this will help to build our visual memory for this character. So you can see I'm using guidelines again, but I'm using guidelines from both the front and the side view. Um, and it can be a little tricky, right? You have to, like I said, you don't want to go overboard with the amount of guidelines that you're using because it can sort of easily and quickly get overwhelming, and you forget what line is which. So you kind of have to, you know, some of you're gonna have to wing it a bit, but that's okay because I've drawn this character's face now twice, and I think I have a fairly good understanding of what he looks like. So see how this goes. I'm using sort of a rough red line right now, and then I'll redraw it with darker lines. I'll drop this back. I'm just kind of creating some a rough guideline for myself, or rough lines, you know, for myself, a rough sketch, using the same color as the guidelines. And then once I do that, I won't need the guidelines as much. So you see, I just dropped it back there, going back in with a new layer, going in with black ink to solidify those lines. You know, that's another great thing about working in Photoshop is that, you know, you can, you know, with traditional pencil and stuff, you have to be careful of using, you know, uh, two lines that are too thick or dark or confident, because, you know, especially if you're just working on that same piece of paper, you're going to build up the drawing, so you have to start really lightly. With Photoshop, you can draw as thick of a line as you want, and then you can drop it back. Now you can also do that with traditional media. What I do sometimes, if I have a really dark, rough drawing, I'll scan it, and then I'll print it out on paper very lightly, so that I have sort of a ghosted image that I can then go back in with more confident lines. So again, using the you know, the copy and flip, but again, not just settling for that. You got to go back in and finesse the features, because if it's too symmetrical, it just never looks right. It never looks totally right, at least in my opinion. So, you know, in this view, we get a really good sense of how far his nose comes out over that mustache, and and how those eyebrows curve back on his forehead. This is where we really get to see sort of the shape of his forehead and the top of his head, which is important again because if you want to draw him now from, you know, 3/4 angles or some different angles, you have more more built into your visual memory to work from. And so now I'm going to do sort of a 3/4 view, just starting with a really rough, you know, guideline box. That's the thing about drawing characters, in perspective, is that draw yourself. It's much easier if you start off by drawing yourself some guide boxes. Um, just imagine fitting a character or a head or whatever into a container that's easier to draw than a head, and draw that in perspective or in the angle that you want, and then kind of use those. You can see I'm kind of imagining, or at least I was when I was drawing, is imagining the planes of that box as sort of um, uh, projection planes. So I'm thinking about how that face looked in the front view as I'm drawing the front of his face. I'm trying to imagine that I'm actually looking straight on and interpolating his features, um, from that angle. Um, but because I'm now fairly familiar with this character, it goes fairly quickly, and it's I know him. I know the proportions, um, and so it just makes drawing these different angles much easier and much more satisfying. And again, the more you do this before you actually commit to drawing your character in the final medium, or in the final illustrations or comic books, the more confidence you'll have. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this Q&A, and I hope it was helpful. Thanks. Good luck.